Picture a university campus, streets filled with the students chanting for opportunity and fairness. At first, it's a small protest, a ripple of voices. But by July 2024, it becomes a wave sweeping across the country. Security forces respond forcefully, casualties rise, and the political landscape trembles. Fast forward a year, and a courtroom delivers a verdict that shocks the nation. A former prime minister is sentenced to death. Hello everyone, I am Nayan Girigosavi, and this is Current to Concept, where we go beyond the headlines to build the conceptual clarity that every UPSC aspirant needs. Today, we discuss Sheikh Hasina's fall from power and the unprecedented pronouncement of a death sentence that marks a pivotal rupture in Bangladesh's political trajectory. A moment that reshapes not only Dhaka's internal equilibrium, but the strategic geometry of South Asia itself. For India, this is a textbook case where neighborhood turbulence intersects with national security, border governance, economic interdependence, and the normative questions of democracy. And for UPSC aspirants, this issue spans across GS Paper 2's foreign policy and international relations and GS Paper 3's internal security and migration dynamics. And for political science and international relations optionals, larger theories of regime change, civil-military balance, and regional power politics. To grasp India's stakes here is to understand how one political crisis can recalibrate an entire subcontinent's strategic future. So let's trace this journey. On 17th November 2025, Bangladesh's International Crimes Tribunal convicted former PM Sheikh Hasina for alleged crimes against humanity linked to the 2024 student protest crackdown. She was sentenced to death in absentia. The interim government sees this as justice. Global rights body have flagged concerns over due process, political neutrality, and the use of capital punishment. Dhaka has formally sought Hasina's extradition from India. However, New Delhi has responded cautiously, citing legal procedures, humanitarian safeguards, and international obligations. So how exactly did Bangladesh arrive here? Three interlinked dynamics are noteworthy in this case. First, centralized power and shrinking dissent. To understand today's crisis, we must go back to the larger political structure. Over 15 years of uninterrupted Awami League rule brought development and stability. But the political scientists warn that long incumbencies often weaken checks and balances, creating what they call a competitive authoritarian drift. Bangladesh showed signs of this drift: limited opposition space, rising centralization of executive power, and the growing frustration among its younger demographic. Number two, the trigger: student protests becoming a national awakening. What began as a quota reform protest soon turned into a deeper governance question. How does the street treat its own citizens? The crackdown, excessive force, alleged misuse of police powers created what scholars called authoritarian overreach. Now, this is a classic GS2 example of state and society tensions, similar to episodes witnessed in Turkey, Thailand, or Sri Lanka. And number three, the transition government and the urgency for legitimacy. When the interim government took over, it needed immediate legitimacy. Transitional justice scholars describe this dilemma clearly. Transitions need justice, but too much speed can turn justice into politics. The Hasina trial sits right in that dilemma. The intention may be accountability, but timing, optics, and political context shape how it's being perceived. Now let's look at some scholarly perspectives here. The democratic accountability lens. The political theorists argue that holding leaders responsible for their acts signals the state power is not above scrutiny. This strengthens institutional trust, a key GS Paper 2 theme. Human rights and due process lens. Rights groups emphasize the principles of proportionality, independent judiciary, and the global trend away from capital punishment. This links directly to India's own jurisprudence on the rarest of rare doctrine. Scholars examine gender in Bangladesh's transnational justice, focusing on Birangonas, the women who suffered wartime sexual violence, arguing that their treatment shows how law can replicate entrenched social prejudices. From the geopolitical lens, IR scholars note that the instability in Dhaka creates a vacuum where China can deepen its economic security footprint. This turns a domestic verdict into a regional security variable, central to India's neighborhood first policy. Now, having discussed this, This is where the recent developments stand on this issue. At the international level, these developments are being closely monitored, with human rights bodies calling for transparency and due process. Dhaka has officially asked New Delhi to extradite Hasina, whereas India has responded with legal caution, examining extradition treaties, humanitarian considerations, and international obligations. China calls this an internal issue, signaling neutrality but keeping strategic doors open. So why exactly is India walking a tightrope? Firstly, because of the border realities and internal security issues. India shares far more than territory with Bangladesh. It shares rivers, migration routes, linguistic communities, economic corridors, and security spillovers. Instability in Dhaka can translate into refugee pressures, cross-border trafficking, militancy concerns, disruptions in trade, power, and transport corridors. These fall squarely under our GS Paper 3 themes of internal security and border management. Secondly, the legal diplomatic compulsion. India must weigh bilateral extradition obligations and the Supreme Court jurisprudence on extraditing individuals facing capital punishment, humanitarian norms, and political fallout in Bangladesh and India's northeast region. India's balancing act between legal obligation and realpolitik is a real-time GS2 paper case study. And lastly, the strategic neighborhood calculus. Bangladesh is central to India's neighborhood first policy, the Sagar vision, and the BIMSTEC connectivity. Any instability risks drawing Dhaka closer to external powers, particularly China, altering the regional power balance. So for India, this is not just about Hasina. It's about maintaining strategic equilibrium in the Bay of Bengal. Quiet diplomacy, back-channel talks, and humanitarian signaling must dominate India's approach. Let's also briefly look at the extradition process in India. Extradition in India is governed by the Extradition Act of 1962, enabling the transfer of fugitives through treaties, multilateral conventions, or even special reciprocal arrangements. The process is guided by safeguards such as dual criminality, prima facie evidence, and protection against political offences. The Union government makes the final decision, subject to Article 21 of the Indian Constitution and India's human rights obligations. With neighbors like Bangladesh, extradition outcomes are shaped as much by strategic diplomatic considerations as by legal provisions. Now, here's how to theorize this new current developments into your UPSC answers. For UPSC GS Paper 2 and PSIR preparation, from the realist perspective, India's cautious response is about security calculation, prioritizing border security, preventing refugee spillovers, and countering Chinese influence. If you look at it from the lens of liberal institutionalism, India and international actors are appealing to norms of due process, human rights, and rule of law, pointing to treaties, international legal standards, and justice institutions. And from the constructivist approach, it considers narratives of justice, victimhood, and legitimacy that shape domestic choices and diplomatic relations. From a political theory perspective, this is a classic case of transitional justice, balancing accountability with institutional stability, which also intersects with legitimacy theory, who has the moral authority to judge former rulers. The situation raises normative dilemmas about sovereignty, human rights, and the moral limits of state power. These frameworks are thus perfect for your mains answer and to step up your interview game. In conclusion, the sentencing of Sheikh Hasina isn't simply a headline. It's a mirror reflecting Bangladesh's deep political fissures, India's difficult diplomatic choices, and the broader questions of justice, legitimacy, and power in the region. For UPSC students, this is a snapshot of how legal institutions, international norms, and state interests collide in real time. Watching how this unfolds, keeping an eye on Dhaka is not optional, but it's essential. If this session has enriched your perspective or your UPSC preparation, don't forget to follow the channel for more such timely updates. You'll find today's notes in the description box below, and let me know what issues you'd want me to discuss in the upcoming sessions. Thank you and keep learning.